Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's event on adapting U.S. strategy to account for China's transformation into a peer nuclear power. My name is Dave Schulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, which devises allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise, leveraging the Atlantic Council's work on China across our 16 programs and centers. Today's event marks the release of an important new Global China Hub report on the implications of the expected and rapid continued growth of China's nuclear arsenal, which is increasingly a subject of concern as the US-China rivalry deepens. Last year's US Department of Defense China Military Power Report, which was publicly launched here at the Council, estimated that China has over 500 operational nuclear warheads, many of which can be deployed at higher readiness levels. This number is projected to double by 2030. China also continues to invest in the necessary infrastructure to support the rapid growth of its nuclear arsenal. This includes building new ICBM silos to enhance the peacetime readiness of its nuclear forces, moving to a launch-on-warning posture, and developing new weapons. In the coming years, the range of nuclear options available to PRC leadership is expected to expand as its arsenal becomes more formidable, enabling a wider array of strategies to achieve their objectives, including nuclear coercion. The report we will discuss today, which was sponsored by the U.S. Defense Threat Reduction Agency under the Department of Defense, represents the culmination of a year-long research project that I led with my fellow principal investigator, John Culver. The project consisted of multiple engagements with leading experts on China's expanding nuclear capabilities and a day-long tabletop exercise to explore, first, how these developments might shape China's behavior during a future crisis over Taiwan, and second, US and allied preparedness for a changed PRC approach resulting from its near-peer nuclear status. The final report we will discuss today aims not only to reassess China's strategy, doctrine, and warfighting approach in light of its transformation into a peer nuclear power, but also to provide actionable recommendations for US and allied decision makers regarding future contingencies in the Taiwan Strait. This work builds on and complements the Atlantic Council's extensive existing body of research on US nuclear deterrence strategies and the future of US nuclear posture and arms control, led by the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and the Forward Defense Initiative's Nuclear Strategy Project. Today, we've gathered an incredible group of experts to discuss this report. First, I want to introduce my fellow principal investigator on the project, John Culver. John is a non-resident senior fellow with the Global China Hub and a former CIA senior intelligence officer with 35 years of experience as a leading analyst of East Asian affairs, including security, economic, and foreign policy dimensions. Previously, as National Intelligence Officer for East Asia from 2015 to 2018, John drove the US intelligence community's support to top policymakers on East Asian issues. We're also honored to be joined by Bonnie Lin. Bonnie is a senior fellow for Asian security and director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, she was the acting associate director of the Strategy and Doctrine Program of RAND Project Air Force and a political scientist at the RAND Corporation, where she analyzed different aspects of China's foreign and defense policy and US competition with China. And last but certainly not least, we have Eric Chan on our panel today. Eric is a senior non-resident fellow at the Global Taiwan Institute. He was previously the China, Korea, Philippines, and Vietnam country director in the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force. In this role, he was responsible for US Air Force military engagement with the PLA Air Force and for directing security cooperation with key allies and partners. He's also served as an analyst with the US Air Force Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategic Deterrence and Nuclear Integration, providing expertise on PRC nuclear doctrine. Now, I'd like to hand things over to our moderator and my brilliant successor as Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, Melanie Hart, who's going to moderate today's event. Melanie joins us at the Council from the U.S. Department of State, where she served as the China Policy Coordinator for the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. In that role, she was instrumental in crafting innovative strategies to reduce nation-state vulnerabilities to Chinese pressure. She developed the Department of State's playbook for responding to Chinese economic coercion and led an internal unit that provided coercion response support to multiple nations. Melanie also developed the State Department's semiconductor strategy for the CHIPS and Science Act's International Technology, Security, and Innovation Fund, and she served as policy lead for the U.S.-Taiwan Economic Prosperity Partnership Dialogue and worked with multiple U.S. allies and partners to address common China policy challenges. And I truly could not be happier that Melanie is taking over the reins of the Global China Hub as I head back into government. So Melanie, let me hand things over to you.
Thank you, Dave. Let's dive right in. John, when I read the report, the thing that really jumped out to me, of course, was your assessment that the PRC would potentially be willing to deploy nuclear weapons in a Taiwan Straits crisis. Definitely caught my attention. Could you share some of those top line findings, and what was that a surprise to you, or what, if anything, did surprise you in the report?
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, I want to start by saying for most of my career, China had a very tightly integrated nuclear doctrine and force size. For decades and really until only a few years ago, it had the least number of nuclear warheads, according to U.S. government assessments, of any of the UN Perm 5. And then it seemed to change overnight, from a slow buildup to suddenly now a rapid expansion. Everything we know about this comes from the Department of Defense, as Dave mentioned, in their annual China military power reports, which are delivered to Congress. I think the first one it mentioned this force expansion was in 2021 or maybe 2022. And so suddenly their force size was unhinged from their stated doctrine of no first use and minimal credible deterrence. So the Chinese have not acknowledged this. They haven't, indeed, as recently as last week, they announced they are sticking with no first use as a guiding doctrine. So then it forces us to consider what their future intentions are as per Department of Defense. They build out this force fivefold over the next decade and beyond. For the game, therefore, we had a very good red team comprised of real substantive experts from both academia and government. And the one guidance we gave them in terms of their role play in the tabletop exercise was, assume you're building this force for a reason, assuming that you see deterrence value in having 1,000 nuclear warheads or 1,500 by 2035. And we want you to play that aspect robustly. So the first thing that surprised me, despite my instructions to them, was how robustly they played that. Over the course of a game scenario that lasted a day and probably expended about a week in game time, China conducted, or the red team in this case, conducted the most robust nuclear deterrence operations that we've ever contemplated. They fired conventionally armed ICBMs at the west coast of the U.S., which were intercepted by U.S. missile defenses. They then launched other conventional attacks launched by ballistic missile submarines against major U.S. military bases in CONUS. These were all seen as really saber-rattling or nuclear warning shots. If we can hit you with single conventional warheads, even if you can intercept those, we could overwhelm you with a nuclear response. And they did other things too that were captured in the course of our tabletop exercise, including counter space operations, the launch of a fractal orbital bombardment system, which they tested according to press just a couple of years ago. So it was a very alerted posture by the PLA. And the other thing that surprised me is how little impact that seemed to have on the blue team, on the red team playing the United States. We didn't have an active and assertive president in this exercise, but it was still very kind of interesting and troubling at one level, because I think nuclear deterrence actions such as the red team employed would have really gotten a lot of attention in U.S. press, among the public, and especially in the president. And yet the blue team was, continued to fight their conventional war plan. There was no discussion about a pause or whatever. I mean, in the course of the game, the red team had invaded Taiwan. They had a lodgment and had gained about 10 kilometers, but we're having a hard time supporting that force, and it was gradually being attrited. So we posed to all the teams, red and blue especially, some really tough circumstances. China had bet the regime on an invasion that could be failing. And then the blue team, the U.S. team, was having to deal with really unprecedented nuclear deterrence operations and a clear threat by China that if things escalated, that it was prepared to go there, if you will. The final thing, maybe, as we get a little into gameplay, and I'm interested to hear from Eric and Bonnie. At the end of the game, China employed nuclear weapons. They attacked Guam with 2 very large devices. And the response of the blue team was really driven by our green team, which comprised all of our allies and partners. And it was really their insistence that the credibility of nuclear security guarantees to them required that the U.S. respond proportionally.
Thank you. So we'll definitely loop back to the allies angle. And I should mention, for the folks joining online, I'll have some questions for the group up here at the top, but please go ahead, welcome your questions, and you're welcome to go ahead and submit them to askac.org, and they'll be popping up on the screen here so that we can present them to this really amazing panel. So thank you for that, John. You mentioned that you had a really robust red team. So I'm really glad that we have one of the red team players here in Bonnie Lin. Bonnie, I know you have a really deep expertise in China military issues, and you've served in the Pentagon yourself. And we're part of this impressive red team for this particular TTX. From your perspective and from your experience in the game, what did you observe as being some of the key U.S. knowledge gaps about Beijing's assumptions and decision-making? And where do you think Beijing was making some false assumptions about Blue Team, about the United States?
Well, thank you, Melanie, for the kind introduction. And I also want to thank the Atlantic Council for inviting me to comment on Dave and John's report, both of whom I have tremendous respect for. And also, I think I would put the two of them in the category of they've probably forgotten more about China than most people will ever know. So I do want to provide a caveat that I did support Dave and John in their early work, but I wasn't able to attend the actual game. So some of my comments are more from a general red perspective, but not actually being able to attend the actual game. So a couple of things really stood out to me about the game that I wanted to highlight, and I wanted to actually plug a couple of points that you, Melanie, have raised, but also John has raised. But I think it's worth highlighting again because of how important the findings are. I think the first is it's phenomenal that we have a game set in 2032, not 2027. Too many games, particularly on Taiwan, is focused on 2027. We're not looking far enough. But also, what's really unique about this tabletop exercise, this war game, was it began in the middle. It began in the beginning of the invasion, but also it looked at what happened in the middle of the invasion. And too often we have games that stop when the nuclear weapons are used or stop after a certain point. And I think I really want to commend Dave and John for trying to go further than what we've seen in most games. I also want to point out several points that the two of them wrote in their report that I think it's very important to highlight. One is what they wrote in the report, which is that the transformation of China's military capabilities no longer represents a linear, stepwise modernization of an outdated military. I think that's really, really important to flag because they're showcasing why the study is so important, that we can't base our understanding of the PLA based off of what we've known about PLA plans, operation concepts from prior to 2015. And that's why this research is so important, to be able to tease out using war games, using getting different red actors together to debate different Chinese options about how China could operate under such a intense scenario. The second point that I want to highlight that I think John made are already in his opening remarks, but I think it's really important to point out is that they're making the point that China's rapid nuclear modernization is not about running faster to stay in the same place. And as they write in the report, China is likely to actively deter or compel its opponents use nuclear weapons to do so and to safeguard its core interest. And I want to reference the ICBM test that we saw in the middle of last week, the first of its kind since 1980. I think this is an example of the demonstration of the findings that Dave and John are finding in their report, of which, interestingly, my understanding is that missile trajectory also flew over Guam, which was a highlight of this tabletop exercise. So again, shows how important it is right now to understand what is going on. The other third finding I want to highlight from Dave and John's report that I think would be useful if we have a little bit of time to tease out is that they find that in certain circumstances, proportional responses toward Chinese aggression may be insufficient to deter Chinese aggression. And if you think about it that way, it's very hard for us to think through, okay, if we are trying to respond to China proportionally and it doesn't deter China, what options does that leave us? right? And I think that puts us, as Melanie, as you pointed, in a world where we're in a much more uncertain world, and perhaps in a world that's more terrifying than what we've thought through. In terms of the actual TTX moves and how China acted, a couple of things stood out to me. The first was at D+3, I was actually quite surprised by China's launching of conventional ICBM tests targeting Hawaii and San Diego as warning shots to the United States. I haven't typically seen that in other tabletop exercises in which you just have one or two missiles being launched for warning shots at such, but those missiles also, if they weren't intercepted, were meant to inflict kinetic damage. I think that's possible, and it's definitely a way of escalation that we should consider. But to me, it seems to make more sense for China to either avoid these shots to begin with, or to have a lot more missiles aimed at these locations. Because at least from how the game was played out, the way that China acted here had very little strategic or military advantage in terms of just lodging one or two missiles as a warning shot. But it does raise a question in terms of how it was playing the game, is how could China think about using ICBMs and these longer range capabilities in a way that warns the United States but doesn't escalate the tabletop. I was also surprised that within 2 weeks of the beginning of the invasion of Taiwan, we had nuclear weapons used. And as John mentioned, these were large nuclear weapons. They were 5 megaton weapons against Guam. One hit a naval base and one hit an air base. So again, depending on how you define tactical nuclear weapons, these would probably not fall in that category. So if China decides to move away from no first use and decides to use nuclear weapons first, it's interesting in this game that they decided to go with a larger use, and they decided to not use it against the specific forces operating near China, but at a further distance. And I think that raises the question of how do we understand what that first use will be? And one thing that I do have for the red team, and it would be interesting to hear from John about this, is did the red team consider a larger use of nuclear weapons first? Because a larger use would have a greater strategic and political effect than, say, a smaller tactical nuclear weapon that's only in the couple kilotons. Having broken a nuclear taboo, would it be more useful for China to have a larger demonstrated effect than using a smaller weapon? I think that was a super interesting aspect of the TTX. I think that's worth flagging. And finally, two dynamics that I think might happen, but I didn't see fully fleshed out in the TTX. One is the report talked about the lack of crisis communication between the United States and China. I think it would be interesting to see what type of communications would be occurring between China and Taiwan. I would, of course, defer to Eric on this, but I would imagine that there would be at least some form of communication, whether China would be doing that directly with Taipei or for parties that they believe might be supporting China's interests or more aligned with China. And that would play into some of the green dynamics there. The other aspect is I was a little surprised that, and maybe this might be just how you can't have everything in the public report, was that Russia didn't really become involved until D+4. And that was when you saw the first public statement from Russia. If I were to look at the state of China-Russia relations now, try to extrapolate that to 2032, I would actually expect more Chinese coordination with Russia. Again, China is not going to ask Russia for permission. China is not going to be telling Russia every single move, but I would expect support from Russia early on, even maybe before the invasion has started. And I think it's interesting that it might be important for us to consider not only political support from Russia, but also to what extent, in addition to opportunistic behavior that Russia may conduct elsewhere, what limited types of maneuvers Russia could conduct around China, around Taiwan, around the periphery that would throw us off, but not really be that costly for Russia. So I'll wrap up my opening comments here, but a fascinating tabletop exercise, and I really applaud Dave and John for sharing the results publicly.
Thank you, Bonnie. So I was going to go to Eric next and hear the Taiwan view, what he observed playing Taiwan. But we just got a question that is really relevant, I think, for John, and that I think is important to address early on, because I would have had the same question before reading the report. And the question is, Xi is a relatively rational leader as compared to Putin. Why do you believe that there is going to be a nuclear competition? I would rephrase that a little bit. And maybe, John, would you mind speaking to what was the reasoning in the report or the conditions under which you could envision Beijing choosing to deploy a nuclear weapon in this crisis. I think it's really important that we lay that out as early as possible because it's an important, very important insight.
Sure. I would say that over the course of the game, China had done, as I said, really unprecedented nuclear signaling. In each case, they hoped that the President of the United States, the blue team, would stop, would slow or find a way to stop its rapid intervention into the Taiwan war. The more pressing issue for the red team, though, was their lodgment on Taiwan was on the verge of failing. And so they had rolled the dice, bet the ranch, had put 150,000 troops onto Taiwan, had gained a lodgment, but then their ability to sustain that lodgment was being curtailed. And so it became an operational necessity that really drove red team. No one told them what they needed to do and how they had to use nuclear weapons, or if they would. But they decided that the great enabling factor for U.S. forward operations was the base of Guam. And then their decision to use 2 5-megaton weapons against Guam was to take it off the board. So the U.S. could not generate long-range strike from the island, couldn't use it as an Iron Mountain for logistical sustainment of forces in the Western Pacific. And so I'm sure we could all question that and maybe come up with other scenarios. But part of what drove China was that at least the way we played it and the way the red team played it, all of this nuclear signaling, conventional ICBMs fired at the United States. By the way, the red team was also doing robust counter space and cyber operations against the United States, all these other means of deterrence and means to threaten, vertical escalation. And it seemed to have no effect on blue operations. They continued to fight the conventional fight. And so it became a matter of extremis that really pushed the red team to do what it chose to do.
I think that's a really critical insight of the report and something that was definitely new to me. Thank you for that. Eric, we just got a question that says, is there anything Taiwan can do to deter PRC nuclear aggression? Too often, particularly in Washington, a lot of people talk about a Taiwan Straits crisis as a U.S. versus China kind of crisis, but Taiwan, of course, is a key player. I understand that you played Taiwan on the green or allied team in the TTX. What were some of your key takeaways, to this question? Is there anything Taiwan can do? What should Taiwan be focusing on as it seeks to avoid a potential nuclear crisis? Of course, Taiwan would suffer more costs than anyone, and that's something we all want to avoid.
Sure. Thanks, Melanie. And I also wanted to thank the authors of this report. This was really engrossing for me, especially because coming from my nuclear and analytic background, was really focused on DPRK in 2018. So you're talking about very different use cases between the PRC and the DPRK, right? With the PRC, uncertainty is really the key word here. They use uncertainty as a method of deterrence and compellence. So that's what drove all this uncertainty during the game. And I think to quite a bit of an extent, it really backfired on the Chinese during the playing of the game. All right. So talking to the TTX, Taiwan is really facing the ultimate nightmare scenario here. And it's not just because nuclear weapons are being thrown around the neighborhood. All right. First is, of course, the threat of nuclear decapitation. So in the TTX, Taiwan leadership had pretty much survived pretty intact up till this point. The invasion was starting to stall. So it looked like from a Taiwan leadership point of view that things were going as good as could be expected, right? They were going to win a long campaign. But with the use of nuclear weapons, all these calculations about time being on their side completely changed. Right. So now Taiwan needs to consider the impact of a protracted war, especially when nuclear weapons are being used. The biggest consequence out of all of this is really the crossing of a psychological barrier, right? Especially for the party leadership, right? If nuclear weapons are being used by the PLA, that means that the party leadership has essentially accepted that nuclear weapon use is the less risky option, right? Despite the high likelihood of U.S. nuclear retaliation, and despite the huge reputational costs of using these nuclear weapons. So from a Taiwan perspective, this really changes the game in terms of how they resist the PRC, right? It means that from their standpoint, they can't assume that, even if the Chinese win, they're going to try something like reconciliation, or there's no going back to the status quo ante once nuclear weapons have been used, right? Especially if the Chinese win via nuclear blackmail, that means the Taiwan leadership would know like there was just no way that this was going to end well for them, one way or another, right? So Taiwan would then instantly ask for some sort of security guarantee to fall under the US nuclear umbrella so that this type of thing wouldn't happen again. Taiwan would also fear the fact that in the future, perhaps the US wouldn't want to intervene anymore, just given all the costs involved. So they would be pressing very hard to change the status quo. They wouldn't be happy anymore with just status quo ante. And then finally, from their perspective, because there's so little that they could actually do to demonstrate to the PRC, I mean, they're not going to use nuclear weapons themselves. What they would like to do would be to inflict as much pain as they could on the PRC in the short term, certainly just to get the PRC to back off. For instance, they would try to reduce that lodgement as fast as possible because the capture of so many PLA would essentially act as hostages against continued PRC nuclear weapon use, potentially up against the island. Right, so nightmare scenario for everybody all around, but the irony of it is that I don't think nuclear weapon use would actually get either the US or Taiwan to back off, and instead would likely try to speed up the effects of the conventional war fighting against the PLA. Right, so what can Taiwan do? Ironically, it would actually be pretty similar to some of the things that they're already doing right now. Right, it's really to focus on resilience, on stockpiling, and on readiness to be able to fight a protracted war. Right, Ukraine's readiness and resilience against Putin's nuclear threats is one of the two reasons why Putin hasn't employed nuclear weapons against Ukraine. I mean, the second and probably the bigger reason is because the US has quietly threatened Putin that if he were to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, then the US would use conventional air power to wipe out his forces in Ukraine. But a key point is that Ukraine hasn't shown any signs of being wobbly against Putin's nuclear use, and that decreases the threat from the nuclear use. And then second of all is constant communications with the United States. In the game, there was something of a breakdown between communications between US and Taiwan, especially once the PLA had been committing atrocities on the island. It was a bit of a gameism, but in this case, Taiwan leadership ordered retaliatory counter value strikes against the PRC, including strikes on the Three Gorges Dam. I don't think realistically that would happen, but it was a way to get to the point where the PRC would be more comfortable with nuclear use. But it still holds here that being communicating with the US, having that ability to know what the US is thinking and what Taiwan is thinking at every point in the game would avoid these type of allied clashes that would potentially lead to unexpected escalation.
Thank you. And Eric, you mentioned some the challenge in communication among allies in wartime. We just had a question come in from someone watching, and the question is, has there been any discussion among the US and allies on reaction to any nuclear moves before it happened? Would any of the three of you is that something that you'd be comfortable speaking to? To what degree are we having the kind of, given the report, which says that this is in the realm of feasibility, are we now having the kind of communication and planning with allies that we should be having to prepare for such a potential eventuality, which hopefully will never come, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't prepare?
I'm happy to start, but I'd welcome Bonnie or Eric jumping in. I think the short answer is no. As I said, the sole basis for assessing that China's expanding its nuclear force fivefold in the next decade. Next decade. It's all based on DoD public reporting through the annual report to Congress and then through annual threat assessments provided by the leaders of DNI, CIA, and DIA, which then unpack a little more about what can be revealed publicly. China has not confirmed these figures, but they also haven't disputed them other than, in terms of U.S. intent in releasing them. I think that this issue is important enough. It deserves to be raised with the Chinese by allies and partners and others, interested parties, including in Western Europe, because the world had gotten used to nuclear weapons as the declining instability threat to the global commons since the end of the Cold War. We had an armory of arms control treaties. Almost all have been swept away now, except for SALT II or START II, and that comes up for renewal next year. So this whole panoply of things that allowed us to no longer have to think about the unthinkable, that fabric is wearing thin. And I think China is now the first country, especially among the Perm 5, the established recognized nuclear powers, since the end of the Cold War, to actually 10 years before the end of the Cold War, to expand its nuclear inventory. None of the other countries have done that, not even Russia. Russia and the United States are still bound under strategic arms limitations to 1,550 warheads deliverable on ICBMs. Now, both Russia and the U.S. have thousands of more other warheads. A lot of them are kind of outmoded airdrop bombs. But China's changing the game here by expanding nuclear forces as it's expanding its ICBM force substantially. And so I think it deserves more of the world's attention, more attention from our allies. It isn't just an issue for the U.S. to be concerned about, and its episodic direct talks with the Chinese raise. It's something that I think virtually every country should be raising with China. Why are you doing this? What is your intent? How are you going to assure the world that you're not risking a new arms race? You say you still subscribe to no first use. In the context of your force expansion, what does this really mean? How many of your weapons are going to be on alert with warheads mated and ready for launch within a few minutes? What are the mechanisms you're using to ensure global nuclear security as you pursue this path? I think all of those are valid questions.
So
if I can jump in. Oh, sorry.
And can I, before you jump in, Bonnie, can I add to the question for you? Bonnie, earlier, I think you mentioned one of the findings or something that arose in the TTX was that proportional responses were not enough from the U.S. to get China to back down. To the allies question, why is that? Do you think that that's because China has already priced in what the U.S. might do, but maybe hasn't priced in what allies might do? We also have a question that just came in saying, how important are Indo-Pacific allies in U.S. response to China's nuclear ambitions? And are there any allies we should prioritize? So, is bringing more allies in key to having proportional responses be more effective? Welcome any thoughts on that. Bonnie first.
Sure, thank you. I think, so I would defer to Dave and John on what they found particular from this tabletop on why proportional responses are not sufficient. But from my perspective, I think one logic that may make proportional US or ally responses difficult to deter China is if China is set on taking back Taiwan, and that is the guidance that they've received from the highest leaders, Xi Jinping or whoever may be in power then, I think China would have already priced in a lot of the costs already, and the Chinese and within Beijing there may be an assumption that China is more willing to suffer costs than our allies and partners. So if they continue to escalate, we, the United States, and our allies and partners will back down. And that was why it was so interesting for me to see the first nuclear weapon use being these 5 megaton weapons on Guam, because that, from my perspective, is not a incremental escalation to nuclear use. It's actually quite a significant escalation of nuclear use. And that showcases why it's so important to be able to understand, okay, if China were to use nuclear weapons first, what would that be? Should we even assume it would be incremental, or could it be significantly more than just the first up the rung in terms of nuclear use. So for example, if I think of the first incremental move China could use with nuclear weapons, that could be used of a tactical nuclear weapon against a US ship or even an allied partnership operating in the Indo-Pacific next to Taiwan. But that was not how the game was played out. In terms of thinking through allies and partners, I would fully echo what John mentioned. I don't think we are doing enough both within the United States looking at different nuclear dynamics. And with our allies and partners, we're still very much focused on how do we fight the conventional fight. I'm actually very interested in how Eric played the Taiwan team, the green team on this, because I feel like I have a lot of conversations with leading Taiwan experts, and it's very difficult to get to a scenario when China uses nuclear weapons when you're talking with some of our Taiwan counterparts. So I'd be very interested in Eric's perspective on what sources is he drawing from in terms of thinking through how Taiwan would respond to this, either from a political military perspective or from a societal perspective.
Eric, can we go to you with that question? That's a great question from Bonnie.
Yeah, sure. So when you're looking at like the way that the Taiwan military and the Taiwan leadership is structured, it's very much risk averse, and also they want to constrain the parts of the fight as much as they can. So when you're talking about the use of nuclear weapons, again, because that breaks the psychological barriers surrounding the use of risk averse options, then really the immediate response then would be to find actions that could get China to go back to its prior actions, to get back to more predictable actions by the Chinese, right? And then trying to, in the purpose of this game would be to see if they could counterattack at an appropriate time, to see if that they could hold these PLA at hostage, and that way put something at risk for the PLA that they hadn't had to deal with before. So again, it's pretty much a nightmare scenario. It's not something that most of our allies and partners do want to think about or do consider. And I think the role of think tank here, as opposed to official military context, would be particularly valuable in terms of being able to play out these type of scenarios. Because on the military side, nuclear plans are very tightly held by the US, and I don't think this is something that will change anytime soon.
So we've received multiple questions that are a variation of asking, are there any other issues like Taiwan that Beijing would consider existential enough that they would deploy nuclear weapons? Maybe another way to phrase it is, this huge buildup. I think, John, you mentioned how much their arsenal has increased and how rapidly. Is that all for a Taiwan scenario, or should we have other scenarios in mind? Welcome any of the three of you to comment.
Happy to go first and be corrected by my betters. Again, China hasn't explained itself in terms of why it seems to have broken out of its previous minimal deterrence, minimum retaliatory capacity doctrine. And so until they do, I have the luxury of imprinting thinking onto them. I think you have to take seriously Xi Jinping's statement that the world is undergoing changes unseen in a century. He's basically making a comparison to World War I, a conflict and aftermath that saw the destruction of, I think, 3 empires by my count, or 4 if you extend it into World War II and the end of the British Empire, and the Empire of Japan. So it's this tectonic eruption taking place, driven by technology, geopolitics, and changes in the international situation. As Marxist-Leninists, the Chinese put a great deal of weight on what they consider to be strategic conditions. So one of the strategic conditions that Xi Jinping seems to have observed more generally, but especially because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that major power war and even nuclear war are back on the table after being off the table since the end of the Cold War. And so then it seems more logical that he would decide, upon the creation of the People's Liberation Army rocket forces in 2016. Prior to that, it was a service called the Second Artillery Corps or I mean, it was a corps called the Second Artillery Corps, to elevate missile and nuclear forces to a full service in the PLA and then provide the resources for massive force expansion is because it no longer suited China's interests to have a minimal deterrence capability, that a new, more dangerous world was emerging, that the potential for war was rising, especially great power war, and that China could be subjected, as they believe they had been, I think, at least 3 times in the past, to US nuclear blackmail, and one time to Soviet nuclear blackmail. So you can see it kind of culminating then in the decision to expand the force. Now, what they haven't done yet is square that circle with how it fits within even an evolved nuclear doctrine. What is their concept of use? If they're going to have thousands of nuclear warheads, and the means to not only harm US interests through retaliation, but engage in mutually assured destruction, then I think they owe, the world and the United States and even Russia an explanation. Like, where are they going with this? Are they going to stop at 1,500 nuclear warheads, roughly around the START 2 or SALT 2 treaty limit? Or are they going to build beyond that? Where are they going with this? And until they explain themselves, you're going to have to kind of envision, Dr. Strangelove nightmares like we did for this TPX.
Eric, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, really briefly. So again, echoing what John said, these changes unseen in 100 years. I mean, really now, it's this idea of Chinese nuclear expansion is largely being driven by Xi's vision that the US is in a terminal decline. So before in the past, we had heard from PLA interlocutors who said simply that the reason why we don't talk about these strategic issues is simply because we're so vastly outgunned by the US and by Russia that it's to our benefit to not talk about it at all with you. But even as China does increase its nuclear strength, I haven't seen any indication whatsoever that they've backed off this idea of uncertainty being a good thing. So I think that's the real issue here, is that I think we're getting to the point where, like, because the Chinese think we're in terminal decline, they're going to try to simply build up these type of nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons can be used even if they are not exploding. Coercion can be exerted even if these nuclear weapons stay in their hidey holes all day long. So what they're seeking to do essentially is to demonstrate to the region that they can overpower the US, even if it came down to a nuclear fight. So I don't see the possibility that the Chinese are going to turn around and talk about what it is that they plan to do with these nuclear weapons, because that's certainly it's just not within their DNA. Until they feel like they have the mastery of the region, they don't see any benefit to keeping the US or allies and partners informed of what they're doing.
So, along those same lines, the report flags the importance of US-China crisis communications as being absolutely critical for finding out what might be an off-ramp that would be acceptable for Beijing to actually diffuse the crisis and not go all the way to nuclear war. Bonnie, I know you've worked at the Pentagon before and have been involved in US PRC mil communications. China shuts those off all the time. And the US, this administration and many administrations before it have made so many efforts to keep that line of communication open, to establish good lines of communication. But every time, it seems to me as a non-mil expert, that every time the US needs to make a call, no one in China is answering the phone, and or Beijing cuts it off as a way just to demonstrate displeasure. So Bonnie, do you have any thoughts on this? I mean, clearly that makes sense as a policy recommendation, but how do you execute on a policy recommendation if, as Eric mentioned, sometimes Beijing believes it's in their interest to not have good communication and transparency?
Thank you, Melanie. I think so crisis communications and crisis comms are useful both during are useful in a variety of situations. I think in the context of an actual war, I think we should probably assume that they're not going to be useful. But it's more in the peacetime or in crisis situations where we're not in kinetic conflict that I see crisis communications being more useful. Because, for example, if we have a collision between US and Chinese airplanes or similar incident at sea, it could be intentional or it could be non-intentional. And it, particularly in the case that if it was not intentional on China's end, they could be interested in various ways of communicating that to us. And I think unless we have those established channels, it will be very hard for us to, in a crisis situation, be able to respond in a way that is useful for both sides and know who we are speaking to actually is an important person or well connected within the PRC system. So I wouldn't say that we can guarantee that the PRC will pick up when we want to, but there's probably more of a probability of use of crisis communications in peacetime or a minor crisis and less use during an actual kinetic and warfighting scenario. But I will say that in an actual fight, we still might see ways in which the Chinese want to communicate with us, right? I'm not exactly sure how it played out in this game, but we could see situations in which China could try to negotiate with different elements within Taiwan and also try to tell the United States that it's doing so, right? There could be ways that China builds in communication with the United States and Taiwan in strategic ways to actually further push through their wartime objectives. And we should also take that into account when thinking about communication. It's not just China doesn't communicate with us only potentially to de-escalate, but also potentially to further their military objectives.
Thank you. And, John, we have a really good question that came in. And it is, the report talked a lot about the U.S. bureaucratic institutional challenges. How can we effectively make changes to current U.S. bureaucracy to create a more effective deterrence posture in a nuclear scenario? And in particular, I know the report mentions siloization of the different areas of expertise that are needed, particularly when Beijing expands not just from nuclear action, but cyber and other domains. So the report really was great at raising that, and would love to hear from you on what kind of changes we should be making so that the U.S. is better positioned to respond.
Yeah, this is the phenomenon that played out in our blue team, which was a large group. It was actually, I don't know, it seemed like 6 cells representing combatant commands, the National Security Council, State Department. But they were co-located, so there weren't any physical barriers to communications, but each was so busy running their parts of the conventional conflict and the NSC then in doing the heavy lift at national leadership. That when China threatened nuclear weapons early in the game through multiple ways, when allies and partners got concerned about those acts short of nuclear use, all the heads started to turn to Stratcom because all the things that I think U.S. seniors understood and were muscle memory built through decades of the Cold War, I think it may be a valid concern that has all atrophied. And that people, even in senior levels, no longer have sort of the natural or learned capability to think about these issues, like how to do nuclear deterrence in wartime, how to control escalation in a conventional fight when your adversary may have a very, very different view than you, especially if you're having problems with crisis communication. I think those are real concerns. And so, within the US government, I think it's safe to say, you have not only a silo over nuclear use relegated to strategic command, you also then have silos of China expertise. I would bet that Indo-Pacific has a fairly robust cadre of China expertise. That's not so true though at like Transcom or even Stratcom. And so building, expertise outside of the silos, having people down into combatant commands and even at senior bureaucracies, at State Department, outside the IC, where people are conversing with these topics, can bring it into relevant conversation now and in the future, in the next few years, so that we aren't, looking at a phenomenon in a crisis and trying to understand it, that we have some basis to both understand the actor and then the tools that they're seeking to employ. And here, this game focused on nuclear weapons escalation and potential use. I stated earlier, I want to just foot stomp it a little bit. China has been building almost as formidable capabilities in the cyber and space domains. And they consider cyber and space operations, along with nuclear operations, as key strategic deterrence tools. And so we focused on the nuclear aspect. I think you could have run a different game that focused more on the cyber or the counter space aspect. I think you would have had kind of a similar result. Now, in the real world, in the event of a conflict, I think all three are going to be very pressing on decision makers and war fighters' focus and concentration. That they've got this four-dimensional fight going on, really starving command and control assets, ISR assets, potentially disruptive and destructive attacks taking place in U.S. key infrastructure that have real capacity to then further degrade sort of strategic communication and understanding. So it's really a multi-stage kind of problem. And I think that it requires, over time that people take agency to bring the expertise, build it, and then distribute it more across the enterprise so that people have a better understanding of these issues outside of a war game.
I wanted to add to that really quick too.
Yeah. And then Eric, can I add another question for you as well? Because I want to make sure we get through everything. One thing that either John or Bonnie, I think, or it could have been of you, have mentioned was that in the game, allies were pushing for the US to respond with nuclear weapons, because once China had deployed them, then there was fear that if the US does not retaliate, then the nuclear umbrella for Asia has disappeared. And, John was commenting on the silos and the need to do more coordination within the US government. Our allies face a similar challenge. And then there's the challenge of coordination among allies, which is always a strain in times of conflict. Could you welcome any additional comments on top of John's regarding the bureaucracy, and also, welcome any thoughts and comments on that allied angle that you must have observed on Green Team?
Yes, certainly. And I think one of the main lessons here is getting a better baseline idea of what allies and partners view as risk acceptance. Right? This is how we accept risk at certain levels of the conflict. And I think we're sort of in the dark about, what exactly South Korea, which had some surprises in the TTX, would view, the U.S. actions that the U.S. took, that the U.S. side thought was de-escalatory, was interpreted differently by the South Koreans, right? And that would also be interpreted differently by the Taiwanese as well. And I think that sort of drives at one of the more depressing aspects of the game, is that this idea of risk, it boils down to almost a return to the early stages of the Cold War, when both the US and the USSR was far more accepting of risk. And what happened then was a number of very bloody confrontations, a lot of accidents, a lot of crises that have essentially scared both of the superpowers into a detente and into greater communications. And that's something that we haven't really seen much of today. Right. To the extent that we see the Chinese communicate, it is only when they are scared. I think there is a discussion with Milley and the Chinese regarding the Chinese fear of an October surprise. And that was one of the few times that the Chinese did use the so-called red line between the two militaries to try to ascertain what US intentions were. So we're getting to a stage where essentially, until the Chinese are sufficiently frightened by the implications of what it is that they're doing, they simply won't stop. So from the US perspective, the best that we can do is at least talk to our own allies and partners to get a better idea of what it is that their thinking is on the subject.
Thank you. And it's a really great insight and a great point that the US and our allies can misinterpret one another too. So it's worth, putting that work in. We're at the last 5 minutes. So to wrap up, I'll go to Bonnie and then John and then Eric. Any final comments, any points that you think are important to raise and leave with our listeners? and or any issues that you would like to flag that are really worthy of more research going forward coming out of this report. So Bonnie, first to you, and then John, and then Eric.
Thank you, Melanie. I actually wanted to go back to a question earlier about, I think when you asked, like, when would China use nuclear weapons or deploy nuclear weapons in other contexts? So I very much agreed with what John and Eric said, but I think it's also important to caveat that in terms of how China may think about using nuclear threats or actual use of nuclear weapons in a crisis or a conflict in the future, aside from the Taiwan scenario, I do think there are much significant incentives for China to continue to repeat what we've seen Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders say, that nuclear weapons cannot be used and nuclear wars cannot be fought. Because even though China has an interest in developing its own capabilities, it does not want other countries to use nuclear weapons, nor does it want other countries to further develop its capabilities. That includes, for example, North Korea. But also China is likely tracking that there's more interest in Japan, South Korea, and other countries to seek nuclear weapons. So I think to the extent possible moving forward, if China has conventional dominance or can can get through a crisis or conflict without resorting to nuclear weapons, I think that would probably be the preferred Chinese approach. But if you're dealing with a very high-end contingency like Taiwan, or if China is facing off against India, I think the risk of using nuclear weapons are much higher. But for example, in South China Sea and some of the other contingencies where the risk of escalation is a little bit lower, I really don't see China purposely and intentionally using nuclear weapons. Though, as Eric mentioned, the fact that China has more nuclear capabilities will always be present in the minds of decision makers.
It sounds like a good research project, Bonnie. Over to you, John.
Yeah, I don't want to make it sound like this is the only outcome or this TTX foreordains this kind of future. I think the main outcome is that it's been a long time since the end of the Cold War, a long time since the initiation of arms control, many of which have atrophied. That I think if a country like China is going to expand its nuclear forces, it owes the world and its own people and the region some explanation of what it's doing. And I think a lot of countries should be raising this with the PRC. And trying to get a better explanation. It may reassure us, I'm not sure, but if they're going to leave a vacuum like this, then you're going to have people like me try to drive into it. I want to pick up on a point Eric made that the early Cold War, there was a lot of risk. It really wasn't until the Cuban Missile Crisis and aftermath, when we in the Soviet Union collectively stared into the abyss, that we decided that war prevention was at least as high a priority as war preparation. And started to put in the means and mechanisms to do that. It didn't happen overnight. It took decades, at least two. But we got to some form of kind of strategic stability that served both well. I'd also make the point that if we're going to see a world with expanding nuclear arsenals, and maybe not just China, Bonnie already mentioned that in South Korea, public opinion polls have shown support for an independent nuclear force for a while, ever since North Korea demonstrated that it had deliverable nuclear weapons. But I'd also like to get people to talk to China, like, do they just assume that nuclear proliferation is now unstoppable? That because of whatever US decline or the return to great power war is a feature of the international system, that they're going to build an inventory that takes into account the possibility for new nuclear threats on their periphery. That would be, pretty stark, and I think that it will also give grounds for a broader discussion, not just with Beijing, but with a broader community, so that we don't all have to go, back into that good night of mutually assured destruction. But we've had a couple of generations since that period ended that didn't have to do duck and cover drill. They have to do other drills, like active shooter drills, but they don't have to do duck and cover drills anymore. And it's, something worth fighting for is that sense of stability and security. And something worth making a priority in our national conversation.
For me, I think the biggest lessons from the green side of the TTX is really that U.S. allies and partners have their own agency, and that this agency will be exercised to a very immense extent once the psychological barriers around nuclear use have been broken. And to this day, we really don't know, to what extent our U.S. allies and partners are going to demand or are going to do post-employment of nukes. So it's probably best to at least begin the discussion, to at least know the people that would be making those decisions of what their thinking would be in terms of, PRC nuclear escalation and who should do what when. Because otherwise you get to a point where you really, China is acting with more unity of effort than the US is with its own allies and partners.
So thank you all. This is such incredibly important work. So thanks for all that you're doing to contribute to it. And John, the report is terrific. I still find it terrifying, but I'm glad the three of you are working this beat. It's a great discussion, and thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us, everybody who joined via web.